Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Livable Cities World City Summit. I'm Steven Pedigo, Director of the LBJ Urban Lab and faculty at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. That's a mouthful. Joined with my colleague and friend and mentor, Rich Florida, well-known urbanist. Rich, good morning. Welcome to see you.
Morning, Steven. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, good to see you. I think you're live from Miami, right?
Live from Miami Beach. It's whatever it is.
For those of you who don't know, Rich is well-known author of The Rise of the Creative Class, New Urban Crisis, Who's Your City, a list of books that go on and on, founder of the Creative Class Group, founder of City Lab, and a university professor at the University of Toronto. So Rich, good to see you. So today's conversation is really diving into the questions around livable city and quality of place. Rich, as I know, much of your early work, and frankly, a lot of your work has been centered around the importance of quality of place as it relates to community building and city development. So would love to just start with, as you're thinking about livability today and quality of place post-pandemic, where we are kind of in the middle of this, what's your thoughts on this? Where are we?
So it's interesting, I've been writing up a kind of what have we learned from the pandemic post for City Lab. So I've been thinking about this a great deal. And, part of that is debunking some of the silly things about cities will die off. It'll be the end. That's all rote by now and everyone understands it. But I think there's two big impacts of the pandemic that most people don't think about. And that I think are the really big ones, not all this nonsense about the end of cities and people moving to the hinterland. The first one is that I think, you and I have thought a lot about the role of talent attraction, and quality of place. And we've been making that argument for the better part of 2 or 3 decades. The reality is that the pandemic has made that far more important. And, where you see that more than anything else is the great Amazon HQ2 competition. Of course, Amazon saying, well, hey, maybe we're just going to hold off on this thing for a little while. Maybe we're going to reduce our footprint in Seattle and Bellevue too. I think that for communities, really, that what we've learned in an era of more mobility, super commuting, remote work, flexibility, hybrid work, is that people want to live where they want to live, and they want to live in a great place that's livable and has quality of place. I think it's important to understand that varies by demographic group. And I think the pandemic has sharpened that. Young people, right out of good universities, where you teach, where I teach, they want to go to big cities, and that hasn't changed, and sometimes I make the funny joke that every young person in America will live in New York City. It's a joke, people, but the point is that young people, because of the economic opportunity, the labor markets, the job markets, the vibrant social scenes, the amenities they like, restaurants, cafes, bars, they like big cities. But once they partner up and get married and start a family, then they move, and they can move just about anywhere. And, it's not just tied to the local suburb. They're now making a calculation about quality of place and affordability. Does it have the schools that I want for my kids? And the ability to have choice in schools. Can I get my kids in the private schools? Are there good public schools? What are the amenity mix that I like? Do I want to be near a waterfront? Do I want a warmer climate? Do I want 4 seasons? And what we've seen is that people are voting with their feet and making those choices. That's the first big one. But the second big one is that the pandemic, I think the single biggest effect of the pandemic, and here I want to quote my dear friend Steve Case, the rise of the rest. The pandemic has really stimulated the rise of the rest, that people have moved. Look at you and I. You teach in Austin. I'm spending a little bit of the winter in Miami Beach, though I teach in Toronto and I'm sabbatical. Look at what's happened in Nashville, where I'm doing some spectacular work with Vanderbilt University and their relatively new chancellor, Dan Diermeyer. But look at what's happened to housing prices, and not just in Miami and Austin and Nashville, and in smaller places. Housing prices and rents have spiked. And what I say is the big impact of the pandemic is the rise of the rest has meant the rise of the rents. And so the second thing is that when people are looking at quality of life or quality of place, they're trying to make an affordability calculation. And that so many of these great places across America, not just New York, everyone is still in this conversation about New York and San Francisco and superstar cities. That's no longer even relevant. I mean, Miami is far less affordable than New York or San Francisco or LA. I'm assuming Austin is still a little bit more affordable, but it's not affordable the way it was 5 years ago. And when you look at incomes, which tend to be lower in these rise of the rest places. So I think the pandemic has made quality of place or quality of life and livability much more important. But on the other side of that, it's made housing and rents surge so much that that's become difficult. And now people are going to say, let's look at other parts of the country which may offer some quality of life or quality of place at a more affordable price point.
So Rich, one of the things that jumps out to me about the question of livability is that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is maybe me being a naive, is that as we were talking about quality of place maybe 5 to 7 years ago in the world of economic development, housing affordability was not front and center, right? And now, as we talk about livability, it seems to me that you can't divorce the two, that the affordability question is front and center for policymakers. Are you seeing that in your work as well, as it relates to your advising of cities and mayors across the country?
For city leaders, mayors, council people, economic developers, community developers, this is front and center in a way that, it's always been there. Charles Thibault, ages ago, when he invented the words voting with your feet, before you were born, maybe when I was a little baby, he invented the words vote with your feet. The idea was you were voting with your feet to look for a package of services and amenities at the price point you could afford, a tax rate, access to schools, whatever that was. Yeah, but I think that housing has become so gosh darn expensive that it's become, and you look at just what happened during the pandemic. I think this is a ballpark figure, but I think about 40% of all homes bought were bought by baby boomers. Well, what is that telling you? That in order to buy a house, you needed equity. And if you didn't have equity, you're not getting it. You could, but it's getting very hard to get into the market. And I look at what young people have to endure in a place like Greater Miami to buy a house. They can't buy one. They can't afford it. It's too much money. And then the other thing that people don't talk about, when you reset prices to a certain degree, property taxes don't matter. But now, when you reset prices to a certain level, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $1 million, property taxes start to get the carrying costs in terms of property taxes become difficult, if not impossible. So now you've got a double whammy of not only the high purchase price and the entry price, but now to carry it, you're paying really high property taxes. So yeah, I think that or affordability, you and I thought about this when I was writing New Urban Crisis. We're talking about this all the time. We thought about it as a superstar city problem, as a New York, LA, San Francisco, maybe DC, maybe Boston, maybe Seattle. There's probably a few other, Santa Barbara. Look, I don't have everyone named, but the kinds of places.
Yeah,
now it's become an almost everywhere problem. It's not quite everywhere, but all of those rise of the rest centers that people had been hoping and praying would take off, that reach launch velocity, all of those places have become horrifically. And, I can only say this because I'm from Newark and I think of myself as a New Yorker. So people listening and watching, you can't hate me for this. What happens when New Yorkers move? People think New Yorkers are smart. They're not. New Yorkers are not smart. They're like, okay, I want to move to Austin. That house is worth $350,000. I'll pay $700. Oh no, I'll take it for $800. And when you unleash these people with equity, I'm making a silly point, but when you unleash these people with lots of equity from San Francisco and LA and New York, and you say, well, that's great. They're going to move to all these rise of the rest places. What they do is they carry with them a lot of equity and higher incomes, and they just immediately fundamentally change the housing market. So yeah, for economic development, it's interesting. Affordability becomes a critical part of the economic development equation.
So how does it reset how does it reset policies for policymakers though, right? And particularly the economic development, urban development community. It seems to me that the old ball game of the way we used to practice economic development has to change, right? Where it was all about company attraction, even talent attraction now. We could argue that pulling back and looking at placemaking, policies around affordability, policies around how we think about remaking our downtown districts and kind of wrapping our hands around the issues that COVID has brought us with remote work and such, really has put a new set of challenges in front of the city building community. Thoughts on that?
Yes. So, I mean, you and I have written on this when we were both at NYU. We wrote this report, and folks, maybe they can circulate it. Maybe we can put it in the chat. Maybe we put this report on anchor institutions and inclusivity.
Yeah.
And I wrote, based on what Steven's incredible research, I wrote this little post in CityLab. But the argument there was that these anchor institutions were not just about cluster building and talent attraction, development, and recruitment. The anchor institutions had to be about inclusivity. I think what the pandemic did was increase the role of anchor institutions. As corporations have become more footloose and less tied to place.
And you're broadly defining anchors, right? You're broadly
defining. An anchor institution, the best example is a university or medical center that is kind of anchored. It's not going to move. Harvard's not going to move from Cambridge. The University of Texas at Austin is not going to pull up shop and leave in Austin. The University of Michigan is not going to leave Ann Arbor. That's the kind of thing. Anyway, Carnegie Mellon is not going to, it's a part of Pittsburgh's fabric. So I think what it's done, because corporations are footloose, not all of them, but it's made the role of, and I've been thinking about it this way. The role of the university, which was important in the early parts of this economic transformation and the rise of the knowledge economy, which we saw particularly in Pittsburgh, but you saw it at the University with the role of the University of Texas at Austin, George Kosmetsky, IC Squared. If you go back and look at it, almost every tech hub has a university at its core. We forget that. Boston wouldn't be Boston without Harvard and MIT. The Silicon Valley and San Francisco would emerge. The Austin was based, not that the Texas was the university was a driver, the Pittsburgh's Renaissance. But what it means now is that the role of the university is even more fundamental. It is I hate to say it, but if Pittsburgh, I'm just using Pittsburgh as an example, we're both familiar with it. We love the city. If Carnegie Mellon and Pitt were important to Pittsburgh when I moved there in the 1980s, there were big companies though, that were all part of the action. Steel companies, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, all these companies, the Pittsburgh Bank and PNC. Now the university and its president become kind of the fundamental actor. Not say that corporations have become more footloose, management comes and goes, but in almost every community, the role of and this is where I think, in thinking about the next generation of city building, it's not just about building that cluster and technology transfer. Universities are really worried about how their faculty are going to get housing. They're thinking all across the country, University of Toronto in Canada, how do we build affordable housing? Well, how do we begin to think about that as a community problem, community issue, not just for the university? So I think workforce housing, affordable housing are part, and what's interesting to me about this for folks listening in is in an era of remote work, what you tend to get is people fragmenting and decentralizing. And I always like the example of NYU. I use universities because I'm a professor. We can use other institutions. Almost everyone is back in their office at NYU. Well, in many universities, they're not, because everyone lives on campus. And they live in small apartments and they got to walk to their office. I think that's what people are beginning to think about. How do we build communities? And I think our downtowns are ripe for this, right? Where we have to repurpose those big buildings and the offices and the Class Bs and the Cs. How do we build communities that are multidisciplinary and multifunctional? And what kind of housing? And we have an opportunity because so many of our office buildings are not going to come back. Now, some of them can be reused, some of them have to come down. But yeah, I think we're talking about community building and building proximity where people want to live in affordable housing, because if not, we're just going to fragment.
So community building kind of being kind of this economic, kind of 3.0, right? Almost. If you think about, business development, old school, kind of 1.0, kind of the whole idea of going all in on talent development. Now, communities that are really kind of moving to the next layer of economic development or community building is sort of saying, it's not just about talent attraction and business attraction, it's about building inclusive communities, community development, affordable housing, all those, and reimagining how they think about, they live and work in their spaces. Dive a little bit deeper into your thoughts on the role of remaking of CBDs, central business districts, downtowns, because I know you've written a lot about this, and I want to unpack that a bit as well.
I just want to pause that because you made such an incredibly smart point about economic development 3.0. That's why I love our dialogues that have been going on for the past few decades. Just sharpen these insights. Economic development 1.0 is about company attraction. And if you get a company, and then cluster. If you get a company or build a cluster, the people will come because they're good jobs. And we realized that worked, but didn't completely work. That had a role. Economic Development 2.0, which you said so aptly, was, well, that doesn't work completely. What we need to do is develop a talent infrastructure and a talent ecosystem. And we can't just generate talent. We have to attract and retain our talent. So we need some quality of life. And, when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, when we met, look, cities were dead. I mean, we'll come back. Like, cities were counted for dead. So what I was saying, the suburbs were doing their job, providing affordable housing for families. That cities had a shot, the New Yorks, the Bostons, the San Franciscos, the Pittsburghs, the Clevelands, because these young people wanted a vibrant environment that they could find in the city. So then we got this big surge of effort, that I was chronicling, not catalyzing, chronicling, about doing that. And it worked. But now 3.0, that what happened in the pandemic with remote work is people could basically rethink their locational strategy. And then it's not just enough, and that young people alone won't carry your city or carry your metro. You need the full portfolio of demographic groups. So then 3.0 comes along and it says you have to build not only quality of place, but you have to do things which build inclusive, vibrant, exciting communities that are affordable and that force people, because the natural tendency will be to pull apart. We're going to have to provide affordable housing options in areas where people, to get those benefits of the cluster, of the concentration. That I think you said, and then where does the CBD look? Oh, sorry, guys. I'm a professor. Robert Fogelson, written in the late 1990s, early 2000s, downtown. You can't see the small print here. Its rise and fall, 1880 to 1950. Most thoughtful people believe that downtown was done in 1950, right? That suburbanization, so-called white flight, the beginning of the malls, the movement of corporate headquarters had killed downtown. What saved downtown in the 2000s was this idea that young people and the so-called, I'm making fun of myself, the creative class wanted to be in urban environments. But it wasn't a real solution. It was a tactic that we've never done what we need to do. Jane Jacobs in 1955 writes Downtown is for People, in which she says the corporate complex downtown is an artifact of the past. It's not a real neighborhood. It's deadly boring. It's dull. It won't work. And what's actually been happening is our downtowns, which are the last gasp of the kind of the factory-based industrial capitalism where you pack and stack knowledge workers, and people hated the commute and they didn't like their cube farm and they didn't want to work there, but they felt like they had to go. The pandemic destroyed that. So now the only hope is to make the central business district a neighborhood. And what you find when you look around cities is that all of the neighborhoods surrounding the central business district, which are multifunctional neighborhoods, are great. They're filled with people and they're exciting. It's just the core that's dead. And you see this in every city. You see it in New York, you see it in Boston, you see it in Seattle, you see it in San Francisco, you see it in Toronto. That monofunctional core is dead. And the action is kind of bled over into areas adjacent to it. And that's where the tech companies want to go and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so yeah, now I think people say, oh my God, urban gloom and doom. The real challenge, and I think the great opportunity, is to rebuild the CBD as a neighborhood. I've never seen a better opportunity to make better cities than this. I mean, I understand for city leaders, it means a hit to the tax base. It means a hit to the revenue. For the property owners, well, you took your risk. But the opportunity to remake the CBD into a real neighborhood, that's once in 100 years. And we've got to grab the bull by the horns and take it.
And Rich, the thing I think I'm hearing from you is that this doesn't require a complete new model. What you're suggesting is that lessons to be learned are actually within our cities themselves, right? I think about, Pittsburgh and the remaking of downtown Pittsburgh. You and I know Pittsburgh. We share that commonality there. Is that look at like Shady Side and the South Side and Squirrel Hill, all great functional neighborhoods that have great lessons to be learned. Oakland, for instance, that have great lessons to be learned that could be applied to the central business district. We go on and on, right? We could point to my neighborhood in Austin and lessons that could be applied. So it's not the idea of having to come up with a completely new model by which we think about our CBDs, but basically, I think what I'm hearing you say is let's look to our current, some of our flourishing neighborhoods in our current areas and look to say, how do we remake our CBD into the same sort of vein that these neighborhoods are basically done themselves? Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think the test case, of course, not perfect, is New York City's financial district. I remember,
Good
I
example.
think
Yeah.
I was writing Rise of the Creative Class when that happened, and my good friend Rob Yarrow, who was then writing the Regional Plan Association, why don't you come up and help out? And we developed this strategy for the financial district, which was based on building a neighborhood. And people thought we were crazy, increasing residents, increasing hospitality and tourism, moving university-based educational institutions, creative-based institutions. And not to say that was perfect, but it worked to a degree. The financial district is in much better shape now than Midtown. But the point is, yeah, I think we know how to do it. And people are reticent to do it because of what's going to happen. But the other day I saw that Kim Mai Cutler, the San Francisco Bay Area thought leader, now venture capitalist, she tweeted, but people are finally waking up and realizing that downtown San Francisco has to have more educational institutions, higher educational. You look at what's happening in Michigan with the Innovation Center, that the University of Michigan is going to be part of. I think we're going to see a big, not a shift, an acceleration, because what do downtowns have? They have great location, and they have, in most places, good highway connection, and in some places, great transit and transport access, mass transit access. They're the natural place to put educational institutions. And maybe we made a mistake by moving some of these out to the burbs. Maybe, and one opportunity is to shift some back of that, especially when space is cheap, back to the center core, and making the downtowns a little bit more, and then of course increasing because people like to live there. And I think the other part of it is we've thought of downtowns for good, I'm not saying for the right reasons. This isn't the case in Europe where families live downtown, but in the United States, because of schools and crime, downtowns have typically been thought of as places that people without families, you have young people, people with a stroller, and empty nesters. I think you've got to think about affordable family-oriented housing in downtowns now. And that's got to come with schools. We think about some of the stuff we worked on in New York, even around the neighborhood where NYU, where the development would require some investment in childcare, some investment in schools. Yeah, I think you've got to talk about units that are bigger, that have rooms for kids, that people will live in multifamily buildings with families if they're for families. But if you feel like your kids are a burden, there's no place for them to play, they make noise and they get yelled at. So yeah, I think it means rethinking downtown, and that forces us to do a little bit less of the patching that we could do during the great era of young people flocking back downtown. If we're going to make downtowns functional, they've got to be downtowns for everybody. And yeah, but we have the opportunity's here now for the first time, in my life.
So what does it mean for suburbs? Like, how do we take this? I mean, because there seems to me a lot of opportunity for suburban communities on the table too, that are willing to look to this as an opportunity, getting out of that traditional suburban development. The thing I think that always strikes me is how cautious policymakers are in suburban communities to adopt multifamily housing for families and others. And one of the things that I know that you've argued for, and I have as well, is that for suburban communities to be relevant, they have to be embracing these new types of housing models, and maybe actually looking not to downtowns and CBDs as examples, but these neighborhoods and central business neighborhoods and urban communities as examples. Thought on what it means for suburban communities?
Yeah, well, I think suburban America is obviously where most people live. A share of people live in urban areas, a share of people live in rural areas, but America is a suburban nation, and I always say if I was going to write another book, which I really don't want to do, it would be on the suburbs. I think that is the area that really needs, and there have been great books on the suburbs, but it's an area where I'd like to focus. Look, I think what's happening in this shift, this demographic shift at the margin with post-pandemic, is it's really what you're talking about is a set of family formation moves. That what happened was all these young people who moved to cities between the year 2000 and 2010, the big boom year, 2000 and 2015, all of a sudden became not so young. They became family forming age. And of course, when the pandemic hit, all at once they said, if I was thinking about moving, I'm moving. They're a different cohort than the Leave It to Beaver family of my parents' generation. They want some level of excitement. This is the group David Brooks, everyone forgets, David Brooks called these people the Bobos. That's what he meant by the Bobos, not the urban verbs. He meant the people who were looking for the hip, interesting suburbs with a coffee shop and a restaurant and a movie theater, what Chris Lineberger called, in his great research, the walkable suburbs.
Yep.
When I talk to people, this is what they want. They call it an urban burb. You talk to these, I want to live in an urban burb that has coffee and restaurant and a movie theater and a place to go work out and a great gym. I don't want to live in a faceless place of nowhere. And what happened, of course, with the pandemic, if housing prices rose, in these walkable places in Miami, in Austin, in Nashville, in wherever it is, Michigan, I know because my wife's family's here, their prices went 5x. They didn't go 50% up. They went because the New Yorkers and the San Franciscos and Los Angeles people are like, oh, I'm watching. I'm like, I want to live in a suburb that has something going on. These were the places most highly desired where we had the greatest housing affordability challenge. So yeah, I think for suburbs, the message is they have to borrow a little bit of the texture and vibrancy of urban areas. In some cases, if they're older, they do have a little downtown. If not, they've got to remake parts of themselves to be like that. And yeah, I think there's phenomenal opportunity. It's happening, right? It's happening all across the country. One of the great things that's happened in America is that when I started to write Rise of the Creative Class in the late 1990s, New York City and Boston and Chicago and San Francisco and LA, they were really different than the rest of the country. Now I always say, I can find better restaurants and better coffee shops and better amenities in small cities and in some suburbs, because at least until recently, housing and space was affordable. So yeah, I think we're going to see more and more of this, And one of the big pluses that suburbs and rural areas are becoming more exciting and more dimensional and more mixed use. So yeah.
We've just got a few minutes, and I'd love to get your thoughts just to add into this conversation, because I know you've also been thinking about this, is the layer of health and wellness. As we talk about livability for cities, many cities are obviously thinking about affordability and cost and the things that we've talked about for the last 25 minutes. But it seems to me health and wellness has also become kind of front and center of our world as it relates to city building post-pandemic, and just wanted to give you thoughts to offer some insights there, maybe.
Yeah, one, I think it's this is not a trend and this is not a fad. That's what I want to say to folks out there listening and watching this. There are structural reasons for it. One, we're living longer and we want to live better. We don't want to decline the way some of our parents did and live lives of misery and despair. We want to stay healthier. Two, because we have to work longer, we have to stay healthy and in shape and fit, because our labor market, like it or not, is biased towards younger people. Three, this is a fact. Because of the front loading of our careers, we are delaying marriage. And if we're not delaying marriage, we're delaying childbearing, children. So that we're older parents, and we're older parents. I'm an older parent with a 5 and 7-year-old. You don't want to be this old grandpa, with little kids. You want to be a fit parent. I think this fitness and wellness has to do with our labor market, the competition in the labor market. It might even have to do with the competition for partners, right? We're looking for partners later in life. We got to be fit. We can't be gross. And certainly if we have kids, we want to be there. So I don't think this is epiphenomenal, and we want to live a longer, healthier, better life. So for that, people are shifting a lot of their attention. There's a great venture capitalist. His name was Henry Morgenthaler. He lived in Cleveland, but he was basically one of the people who invested in all of the cool venture capital funds in Silicon Valley. Henry died about a decade ago. The last time I talked to him, he said, when I was a young man, I invested all of my money in semiconductors and computer startups because that's where the action was. He said, if I was a venture capitalist today, I'd invest all of my money in health, wellness, fitness, healthcare, medical care, because life extension and quality of life is going to be where it's at. That's part of the quality of life. So yeah, I think whether it's an office building or a housing development or an innovation district, a new center, wellness and health and fitness. And when you look at surveys of what workers want, they don't want the run-of-the-mill office. They want a place to meet and connect with their colleagues, to socialize and build ties, but they want a place that contributes to their health and wellness. So I think it's a big deal. And certainly, I think you're probably the same way. When I look at communities to live in, I look first, I don't just look where the coffee shop and the great restaurant is, And if you look at, I wrote a post on this, folks. It was just fun to me when I was walking around Soho one day. with Steven. I was walking through a neighborhood that was all filled, that used to be filled with people smoking cigarettes at night and going to bars and going to clubs and outside with their drink. And we were walking around in the morning early, and people were getting an espresso. There was a juice bar and there was a Pilates studio and a spinning studio. And the place that used to be a nightlife district had become a health and wellness district. I also think these health and wellness hubs are a big deal. Like they're kind of where people are gravitating to. And it's, in most cases, it's organic. It's a gym they like, or the yoga studio they like, or a juice bar they like. Then I don't want to be too twee about this, but I think health and wellness is a big driver of people now in a way that certainly wasn't in my parents' generation. Parents were smokers. Certainly wasn't part of my youth, but now has become a big driver of people's lifestyle and I would say very importantly, their location choices.
I think that's right. I mean, I think about, looking at my community group here, and a lot of us build our community with our gyms and our health facilities become kind of these community facilities, right? So that's one way to kind of think about this idea of community development is, can you think about housing affordability and all those types of things, but do we put health and wellness kind of front and center by the way we think about development going forward, for sure.
Our friend John Austin, right, wrote this incredible piece on Traverse City, and another Michigan reference because my wife's family's from there. Not many people from the coast have been to Traverse City. I've been to Traverse City, but the whole strategy there was outdoor activity, outdoor amenity, using the lakes, winter sports in the winter. And he argued that this was an exemplar. John argued this was an exemplar of using quality of life and health and wellness. Look at what's happening in Northwest Arkansas with biking and biking trails. And people are passionate. I mean, I know this sounds silly, but people are passionate about their fitness activities. And I've always said, even going back to the rise of the creative class, you build some friendships at work, but you build a lot of friendships through these extracurricular activities. And it could be playing chess. It could be a cooking class. But for many people, it's fitness, right? In this world we live in, they want a running group, a cycling group, a workout group, whatever. Different strokes for different folks. But I think this is very important to people's quality of life and their identity. Like their activity is important to their quality of life and also who they identify as people. And what's other interesting about this, just for folks listening in who might think this is twee and silly, like I went to visit Lake Nona a couple of years ago. This is a big development outside of Orlando. And it's very interesting on a whole bunch of levels. But what they said is they're going to be a center for human performance. And part of that, they recruited a U.S. Tennis Association facility, and it's spectacular. But they actually added this kind of, I forget who did it. It's a big company, but the Center for Human Performance, where not just athletes, but like CEOs go and business leaders go to get these full health assessments. And if you're overweight, they put you on a program. And all of this just to be healthier and more fit and have more attention. And he's developing a whole community and cluster around this. Look, I don't think it's just about, the coffee bar and the Pilates studio. I think there's a bigger trend towards human performance, optimizing your ability to live longer and better, to be strong, to be flexible, to have mental acuity. That's a big deal. And I think people are looking for more of it. The sad thing here is that all of this reflects our divide. And there's the 30% of us or 40% of us with college degrees who can take advantage of this. And then there's the folks who don't have the financial ability or economic ability or free time to do it. So all of these are reflections of our fundamental economic divide. But for the talent-based economic development, technology-based economic development, quality of life, livability, health and fitness are fundamental parts of this.
Yep. So Rich, we're at time. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for a great conversation. It's good to see you and good to connect. It's been a while. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. And I hope to see everybody in person in the not too distant future. Great being with you.
For those that are joining us for the summit, we're up to our next session is Housing 2.0. You can join that over by clicking over on the next session over. Thanks so much. Cheers.